I'm Sabrina Trobak with Trobak Holistic Counselling. In this week's video, we're going to look at anger. Anger is a very significant coping strategy that many people use to try to deal with anxiety. When we're feeling anxious and that anxiety builds and builds, we need to find a way to distract from it. Anger is often a coping strategy because anger works in the moment. When we get angry, people back off and leave us alone, and the anxiety can go down. Anger still damages relationships and isn't a healthy coping strategy, but it is one that works. Anger works when we are getting angry, people back off and leave us alone, but anger also works even when we're not angry. If we have a bit of a reputation as being someone who is angry, people generally don't bother or don't challenge us because they don't want the potential for anger to happen. So anger becomes a very significant coping strategy because in the moment it works. It damages connections and relationships, but it works. Anger is not a standalone emotion. What that means is there's other emotions underneath anger that we don't really like to feel. We just talked a bit about anxiety, and that is one of the emotions underneath anger, but there's also several others. Rather than feeling these emotions, we become angry as a way to distract or push those other emotions down. Underneath anger are things like anxiety, lonely, fear, rejection, abandoned, feeling like I don't belong, not valued, vulnerable, unappreciated, feeling not good enough or not important, unloved, powerless, sad, betrayal, disrespect. We generally don't like to feel these emotions, so when they come up, we switch it to anger so we don't have to feel them. Likely, if you think about a time in the last while where you've been angry and you stop and really think about what was underneath that anger, you will realize that some of these emotions did pop up for you. There is a cycle of anger that happens, and this cycle becomes very difficult to break. This cycle can happen many times in a day, or it can happen once every couple weeks or once a month. But we definitely have this cycle that does get repeated. The cycle starts with the explosion. This is where the person is getting really angry, yelling, screaming, swearing, hitting things, throwing things, whatever it may be. After the explosion, we have what's called the honeymoon stage. This is where everything just seems kind of calm. There's a bit of a sense of peace. There may be apologies or gifts or going out for dinner, promises that it won't happen again. And so things just seem a little bit more settled. But this part of the cycle doesn't last for long. And then daily living starts happening. With everything that we do, it creates emotion. So over time, this emotion generally builds and builds and builds until we need to get a release because the emotion is too overwhelming for us. So we look for a trigger. The trigger is the next part of the cycle. This is something, anything, the excuse that we can use to have the explosion happen. So the trigger can be different from day to day, but the trigger is not the thing that's creating the anger. It's this built up emotion that is creating the need for the anger. So the trigger can be anything. It can vary from one day to the next. For many families living in this cycle of anger, they work really hard to try to reduce the triggers. But it's not about the triggers, and you can never reduce them. There's always something that someone can use to get angry. In this cycle of anger, the most significant or challenging part for most families is living in the daily living part. This is what we call the eggshells, where we know there's going to be an emotional outburst, an outburst of anger, but we don't know when and we don't know what's going to trigger it. So we're left waiting, walking on eggshells, wondering what it's going to be this time. This is an extremely stressful time for most families because it's predictably unpredictable. But this is also a stressful time for the person who has the anger because the emotion is building and building and building. So this is also a very stressful time for them. What I'd also like to talk to you about is a strategy. This week's strategy is taking a break. We know from previous videos that when we have a lot of anxiety in our brain, we have a lot of cortisol. Cortisol takes time for it to go back down. When we have high cortisol in our brain, our ability to use logic and reason and think through things is significantly diminished. So taking a break is a very important strategy. We need to take a break. We need to leave the situation. We need to stop. We need to stop for a minimum of 20 minutes, possibly even longer. If we don't take this break, the chances that we are going to end up damaging relationships becomes really, really high. One of the things you can do when you're taking a break is another coping strategy. And this coping strategy is about controlling our thoughts. What happens is we have a thought which then creates a chemical reaction and we feel it in our body. That feeling we feel in our body are our emotions. So our thoughts create our emotions. If I have a happy thought, I'm going to feel happy. If I have an angry thought, I'm going to feel angry. If I have an anxious thought, I'm going to feel anxious. So we have a thought which creates a chemical reaction in our body, and then we feel it physically in our body, and that's how we feel our emotions. So if we can learn to control our thoughts, we can also learn to control and manage our emotions. We don't really need to worry too much about managing our emotions. What we need to worry about managing is our thoughts. We need to get better at being able to acknowledge our thoughts and allow ourselves to feel the emotions that are connected, to challenge our thoughts and think differently. If we're having a thought where we're worrying about handling something, we're going to create worry, anxiety, nervousness. But if we challenge that thought and we figure out how to solve that problem and we think about how we can handle it, we're going to feel content, calm, relaxed. So we need to work on using our thoughts to control our emotions. The more we control our thoughts, the more we control our emotions. That's it for this week. Take care and stay safe. I hope to see you all again next week.